We are very fortunate to have Rick Becker with us this evening to tell us a little bit more about that crucial battle. Please join me in welcoming Rick Becker.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. My name is Rick Becker. The sign outside says World War II historian, but I'm really concentrated more on my knowledge to the Pacific Theater and a little more specifically to Pearl Harbor, and certainly more specifically to Midway. I got interested in the Battle of Midway, some 15 plus years ago, and have kind of focused on it ever since. So I've given this presentation a couple of times previous to this, and it had been a little bit longer, so I trimmed it down. So I might not get as specific as some of you might like me to get, but feel free to raise your hand, ask a question at the end. I can talk some specifics. I may ask some of you to talk some specifics, because I am definitely not the authority, on the Battle of Midway. Obviously, I was not there, and so definitely at the end, an open discussion would be great. I want to start this a little bit, maybe a little differently, and not at day one or just previous to the battle, but I want to talk about what led up to the Battle of Midway. And there was a lot going on. Even though Midway was 6 months into the war, there was a lot going on that led up to the Battle of Midway. And some of what I'm going to talk about is opinion. Most of it is fact. And so I'm going to talk about the lead up, the battle itself, and then the ongoing importance, as Mike said, throughout the war, of what the Battle of Midway did and how important it was to the, as some people say, changing the course of the war. It certainly shortened World War II in several ways. So many vivid descriptions of the battle, and by prominent authors. Some of the, or most of the, time-honored books on the Battle of Midway described it in their titles as "No Right to Win," "Incredible Victory," "Miracle at Midway." And while those are all correct in a way, they're not totally accurate. It wasn't actually a miracle. There were a lot of things, a lot of planning, a lot of things behind the scenes that led to the outcome at the Battle of Midway. And so I want to look at some of the important events that certainly No Right to Win, Incredible, Miracle are all very descriptive, but there were a lot of other things that went on leading up to the victory, the overwhelming American victory at the Battle of Midway. So some of the key facts: Japanese overconfidence. The Japanese thought at that period of the war, coming out of Pearl Harbor, which they felt was an overwhelming Japanese victory. Coral Sea, which was more or less a standoff, and it depends on how you look at what came out of the Coral Sea. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. And they had, even early on in the war, they had victory disease. Everywhere that they were going, they were successful. And they felt that they set the ultimate trap, if you will, for the American Navy and Admiral Nimitz at Midway. And this would be the portion of the war which would put them in absolute control of the seas as they addressed the American carriers in the Pacific. Code breaking, big part of the Battle of Midway as well. Most of you have seen the movie, saw the role that was played by Hal Holbrook as Joe Rocafort, and code breaking played an amazing part in the Battle of Midway. And the code breakers at Hypo in Hawaii convinced Admiral Nimitz that they had indeed broken the Japanese operational code, and Admiral Nimitz had the faith in that group to go with some of their findings. The Japanese complexity of the plan. I mean, the Battle of Midway was so complex on the Japanese side, and if any of you have read The Javelin and the Sword and seen the complexity of what the Japanese put into their plan and how they divided their forces in numerous ways, and we'll look at that on a map here in a few minutes. But like most of the Japanese strategy, it was immensely complicated. Going into Alaska at the same time, 3 separate forces, no backup plan, timing had to be impeccable, just far overly complex. Good luck, and that comes into it as well. And both sides, despite many authors, particularly early on authors, thinking the Americans had all the good luck, they really didn't. There's some bad luck involved on the American side. There was some good luck on the Japanese side. But luck played a big portion of it, and probably played a little bigger portion on the American side just because of the coincidences that all came together in a very, very short period of time and in a finite point on the map. And lastly, decision making on both sides. Big plus here for American leadership, and this is kind of the opinion part, but Nimitz, Fletcher, Spruance, the pilots all played a big part on the American side. Nagumo, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, his indecision on the Japanese side was costly and in many ways what cost the Japanese the Battle of Midway. So I want to start off with, thorough discussion of Midway can ignore some of the lead up to it, and one of the obvious ones is Pearl Harbor. And some of you may ask, how does Pearl Harbor play into the Battle of Midway? And it was a very, very important part. As you know, the Japanese plan at Pearl Harbor was to go after the American battleships. And they did just that, and they were very, very focused on sinking the battleships in Pearl Harbor. Didn't really have a lot of concern at the time for the American carriers. Had very little concern for the fuel tanks that housed all the aviation fuel and the diesel fuel at Pearl Harbor. And their singular mission at Pearl Harbor was to go after the battleships, which they did. And because of the oversight, I guess I will say, on not putting any emphasis or importance on the American carriers, which were at the time relatively few, certainly fewer than the Japanese had, they realized as the war started progressing into the Coral Sea, and then indirectly with the Doolittle Raid, that the carriers probably had a lot more importance than they first believed. So actually, the number's a little lower. This is the next day headlines. But they felt that America, and rightfully so, wasn't ready for war. The Japanese had prepared for a long time for Pearl Harbor and for the war for a lot of economic and political reasons. And Yamamoto, the top admiral in their military, said he can beat America for 6 months, and after that, he said they really, really can't expect him to continue winning the war after 6 months. And he was right. We're going to talk about him a little more in depth and why he said that in just a couple minutes. But in hindsight, he didn't know how right he was when he made that statement just prior to Pearl Harbor. The Doolittle Raid. Again, seems like it's a little bit disconnected from Midway, but the tie-in here is the Doolittle Raid really cut to the core of the Japanese military. It was downplayed very much, kind of scoffed at as an attack on hospitals and schools, and but they really didn't know how the Americans pulled that off, and they didn't know where the planes came from. And some of you may have heard Roosevelt's comments on that, where he told them they took off from Shangri-La. But they weren't sure. They weren't sure, was there a carrier? They weren't sure, did we have a carrier that was capable of bombers and of twin-engine bombers, actually, or did they come from some land base that they weren't aware of? And that was a little bit of the speculation. Here's just another picture of the Doolittle Raiders. By the way, we're just talking before I got started here that Dick Cole is now the lone survivor of the Doolittle Raiders, and he's 102 years old, still very active. He was Doolittle's co-pilot, and still gets around and goes to many events. He was at Oshkosh 6 weeks ago, and still attends a lot of military events, and so he is the lone survivor. For those of you that haven't been, if anybody in the room hasn't been to the Air Force Museum down in Dayton, it's fantastic, and it's really a fantastic way to spend some time, and you can spend a lot of time. I have trouble getting out of the first building when I go, so I start there and I kind of end up there when I go. But the goblets that the Doolittle Raiders had used over the years and got together every year and toasted one another, and when one of them passed, they would turn it over. Those are on display there, and very historic, very touching piece of history. So the Doolittle tie-in was the Japanese got somewhat deeply rattled by their homeland being bombed and the threat of the Emperor's Palace getting bombed, frankly, and they felt that they needed to respond in some way, and the consensus was that there probably were some carriers tied into this, but they weren't sure how, so the carrier thing starts to get more important. Fast forward to the Battle of the Coral Sea, which I also needed to talk about, and the Americans had pretty much a stalemate at the Coral Sea. The Japanese felt that, and again, they had an overly complex plan. They went down there with a couple of carriers and troop ships and just made assumptions that how the Americans would respond. And they got kind of held to a stalemate, and their troops turned back from New Guinea, which was the next stepping stone either to Australia or at least blockading Australia from getting supplies from the U.S. and cutting off the supply line as they expanded their scope in the South Pacific. So again, the importance of the American carriers now became really, really evident. What wasn't important at all at Pearl Harbor, and at Pearl Harbor the focus was the battleships, and they didn't really even, and this is probably an oversimplification, but they didn't care if the carriers were at Pearl Harbor. They were after the battleships. They found out very quickly in the first 6 months of the war how important of a part the carriers would play in the war. So this is kind of a quick map that shows the Japanese Empire 1942, and the orange showing where they had expanded to and where they were aspiring, to move to. And obviously, some very famous points for World War II historians, starting in the far south at Guadalcanal and certainly working up toward Japan. So by that point, by the time of the Coral Sea, actually way down here, and the time of Midway, the Japanese Empire had grown, somewhat significantly and very quickly. Again, the overconfidence, the victory disease, if you will, seeing and believing that they were unstoppable. And they felt that controlling Midway would be a huge, huge threat to Hawaii. And so the next decision was to put together a plan to take over Midway. And for those of you that have either been there or seen it on a map, it's a speck on the map. But Midway is it's composed of two islands, Sand Island and Eastern Island. The value, obviously, is the airstrips. So all this blue is just water. Midway is a very, very, the islands are actually very small. And But the airstrips, because of the proximity to Hawaii and being at the outer reaches of what the Japanese envisioned as their empire, and being able to then continue to push the American Navy and Army back and back and back, Midway was strategically important, and it was also the Yamamoto felt that it was also psychologically important to the Americans, and he felt that he could lay a trap at Midway and send his rather substantial strike force called the Kitobutai with 6 carriers and many surface ships and submarines to Midway and draw the Americans into one final battle and confront what he thought was probably going to be 2 American carriers. Turned out a little bit different than that, but he approached it with overwhelming, in his opinion, overwhelming forces, and thought that would be the battle that would kind of loosen up the Pacific for the Japanese and let them continue on what had started as a little bit of a rampage for the Japanese Navy. So shifting gears here a little bit, mentioned him earlier. This is Joseph Rocafort. He was the top code breaker at Hypo, played by Hal Holbrook in the movie. If you saw Midway, he wasn't near as eccentric as he was portrayed in the movie. He was a very bright guy, worked 22 hours a day, did indeed sleep in a bathrobe because he didn't even go back to his quarters. Very focused, and he convinced Nimitz, as I said earlier, that they had enough of the Japanese battle code broken that they kind of knew what was coming next. It was one of these, they knew every third word, so as they pieced things together and knew some of the ships' names and did some directional things as far as where the ships were, he convinced Nimitz that the next big advance by the Japanese would be to try to take the islands at Midway. The codebreakers in Washington did not like Rocafort. They didn't believe that he knew what he was doing, and he was kind of scoffed at by the code-breaking group in Washington, which was split into 2, into the European group and the Pacific group. And they felt that he was a little bit of a rogue, if you will. And but Rocafort convinced the right guy that he knew what he was doing, and that was Admiral Nimitz. And Nimitz was the guy that ultimately was calling the shots, and he put a lot of faith into this man and kind of put his reputation on the line a little bit, because had he been wrong, it would have had a very different outcome. This is the kind of the battle theater, and you can see the proximity of Midway to Hawaii. The island actually is real close to this international date line right here. So the Japanese were ready to expand, their Pacific empire. You can see where it says Yamamoto's plan. He wanted this circle all the way around here and control all this except Hawaii, and then the next threats were either Hawaii or the West Coast. So Midway geographically was very important. You can see the Coral Sea, how far down it is here, which was first of all Pearl Harbor, then Coral Sea, and then Midway. So the Japanese were very mobile and had a lot of sea power at that point. And in particular, and I'll mention this from time to time, what's called the Kitobutai, who were their 6 fleet carriers, the 6 carriers actually that they used to attack Pearl Harbor. And they were pretty much proceeding at will. So this just kind of is a good overall look at how it works out. Actually, the Americans were a little more on their home court here. And I want to back up a little bit to the Coral Sea, because when the Americans went to the Coral Sea, and I said it was kind of a draw, the Yorktown got pretty badly damaged at the Coral Sea, and the Lexington was sunk. I think this next slide shows some of the battle damage of the Yorktown as it was, actually this picture was as it was steaming back to Pearl Harbor. So the Americans at that point were down to two healthy aircraft carriers, being the Enterprise and the somewhat newly commissioned Hornet, and the Yorktown, which coming out of the Coral Sea kind of looked like this. So by the time the code breakers in Rocafort had made some determination on the situation with Midway and the dates, they were in kind of a hurry-up mode to get the Yorktown fixed, get it repaired, get it seaworthy again, get it battle-worthy again, more importantly, and have it ready for the Battle of Midway. So it came back from with this battle damage, and Nimitz went down to the repair facility and asked them how long he felt it would take to get the ship battle ready again. And at that point, there wasn't any conversation about Midway specifically, which was very highly secretive. But the engineers told him it'd be 90 days. And he told them, and some of you may have heard this story, he told them they had 72 hours to get this ready because it was pulling out of the dock in 72 hours. And they brought in lights, brought in every engineer, every welder, every repairman, and worked 24 hours a day. And in 72 hours, it was steaming out of Pearl Harbor, getting ready to try to catch up with the Enterprise and the Hornet on the way to Midway. So Nimitz tells the story later that, you know, he hesitated to even go to these engineers and tell them that because he thought they were going to laugh at him, but he wasn't really a guy to be laughed at. And so it's he was amazed that they were really able to do it, and we'll see, you know, a little bit how important it was. So the admirals, I want to talk a little bit about, you know, the key players in the battle. Yamamoto, the top admiral in the Japanese Navy. He is the one that made all the strategic decisions, did the planning. He was one of the chief planners. He was certainly the idea guy for Pearl Harbor. And he was the chief strategist. Educated in America, Harvard graduate, and part of the reason, you know, I made the comment a little bit earlier that he said, you know, we can defeat America and we can have them on the run for 6 months, and after that, can't tell you what's going to happen. He knew the might of the American industrial complex, if you will, and knew Japan had no way to keep up with that. That if they couldn't have a quick, decisive victory at Pearl Harbor or at the Coral Sea, and then kind of one more time, you know, at Midway, that they couldn't keep up once the America got ahead of steam and stayed in the war. The Japanese and Yamamoto and most of the Japanese military didn't feel that the Americans had the heart for a long, protracted battle in the Pacific. They thought that maybe Pearl Harbor would take the fight out of America, which did the exact opposite, as pretty much everybody in this room knows. And the same with the Doolittle Raid. It had a great impact on the American people. So a lot of misunderstanding of the thought process of the American people, despite being somewhat isolationist before Pearl Harbor. That turned things around 180, and from there on. Admiral Nagumo, the at-sea commander of the Japanese Kido Butai, their strike force, 6 carriers, some 16 battleships, and the rest of their surface fleet. The commander at Pearl Harbor, often criticized for not going back a third time, and also not doing some of the things I mentioned earlier, but that was not really his call. That was Yamamoto's. Let's not go after the fuel. Let's not go after the sub base. Let's not go after the repair base. Let's go after the battleship. So he did what he was supposed to do, and in all fairness, really shouldn't be criticized for not going back and doing more, because that wasn't what he was ordered to do. So His decisions at Midway kind of reflected, some of the criticisms he was taking. Admiral Spruance, he got thrust into the Battle of Midway. For those of you that haven't done a lot of reading on Midway, that at that time Nimitz's top admiral, and the most aggressive admiral certainly, was Admiral Halsey. And Halsey came back from the Coral Sea and had a very bad skin disease. Depending on what you read and what historians are writing, but it was, somewhat of a serious enough skin disease that the sun aggravated it very badly. And when he got back from the Coral Sea and went in to see Nimitz, Nimitz told him he's going straight to the hospital, and who's your replacement, because the Battle of Midway is coming up and I need somebody. Spruance was Halsey's right-hand man, if you were. He was in charge of the cruisers that accompanied Halsey's carrier, the Enterprise. And without hesitation, Admiral Halsey said, "Spruance is your guy." And Nimitz listens to smart people and listened to smart people, and that was one of his strengths. So Spruance was what ended up being the number 2 person on the battle scene. Admiral Fletcher, Frank Jack Fletcher, was in charge of the entire task force 16 and 17 that went to Midway. It's ironic that neither him nor Spruance were aviators. They came up from battleships, cruisers, and were rather recent into carriers. But they proved themselves to both the officers on their boats and also the crew, even being non-aviators, known as black shoe admirals, and the brown shoes being the aviators. So there's a book out called The Black Shoe Admirals, I believe is the name of it, that talks quite a bit about Admiral Fletcher. Halsey, and again, I kind of told the story of Halsey, and there's been quite a bit written as far as, for a little diversion here, a lot of speculation. Would if Halsey would have been the guy to go to Midway? How would it have changed things? Because he was super aggressive, and that was shown the rest of the war. Sometimes a little bit over aggressive, maybe, but had so many great calls, through the rest of the war that he may have pushed the Battle of Midway farther than it got pushed. And Spruance and Fletcher kind of knew when to say enough. And Admiral Nimitz, the guy at the top, brilliant. The opinion part comes in here again. I'm a huge Nimitz fan. Nimitz was a brilliant tactician. He knew when to listen to people, but he wasn't afraid to make a decision. Wasn't afraid to gamble a little bit. And he was told by the Secretary of the Navy at that time, you can take calculated risks with your carriers, but don't lose a bunch of carriers. And what he did at Midway was pretty gutsy, working under that premise. That because he put some carriers at risk, but he did it on a very calculated basis. So he didn't just run headlong. He wouldn't do what I would call a Halsey. He played the odds and wanted to make sure that he was at least holding as many cards as Yamamoto was. So this is a battle map, and it looks really complex, but I'm going to try to just break it down real quick, and we'll come back to this again in a minute. But this illustrates a little bit of the complexity. So, and I'm going to step through the first portion of the Battle of Midway here, starting from Pearl Harbor. You can see this cordon of submarines that the Japanese had planned to put into place. But their plan got so complex as far as refueling and maintenance that they left Japan late, and they actually had these submarines in place after America's 3 carriers had already passed that point and were already sitting up at Midway, up in this area, laying in wait. So those submarines were sitting there watching open ocean for days, and Nimitz already had his carriers in place up west east and northeast of Midway. Also, and this speaks to the overconfidence part of the Japanese, the striking force here, there were 6 carriers at their disposal. He sent 2 of the carriers up to Alaska, partially because he wasn't sure that the Doolittle Raiders didn't come from a couple of these bases up in Alaska. They were really kind of small, frozen bases. But he sent 2 carriers up there. At the same time, he's attacking Midway with 4 more carriers. So he split his force. He also kept 2 carriers at home that had been damaged in the Coral Sea, that at least one could have been readied had he been, had he had the American viewpoint. He could have readied at least one more of those and gone with overwhelming force. But he figured he had all he needed, and to oversimplify it. So when they felt, the Japanese felt they were going to come up here, attack Midway, and the U.S. Forces in Nimitz would hear about that, after they started moving on Midway, they would then start moving the carriers out of Pearl Harbor and sail right into what they felt would be a trap up in Midway, as they waited for them with 4 carriers, a whole slew of battleships, and the submarines that were supposed to kind of thin out at least one of the carriers as they were making their way up to Midway. Most all of that didn't happen. We've also got the transport group that also speaks to the overconfidence. They were moving troops in at the same time as they were the attack force, figuring it's going to take them 24 or 48 hours to take Midway, and then they'll just move in with the ground forces and just take control of the island with the transport group and their troops. So the main plan, I guess, to summarize, is the Japanese felt they would attack Midway, they would draw the American carriers out of Pearl Harbor into a trap, and as it turns out, and we'll see, in a minute when we get back to this slide again, it kind of worked out the other way, that Yamamoto and Nagumo kind of sailed in to the trap that was set out here by Nimitz, where they lurked out here unbeknownst to the Japanese Navy, and were sitting out there in wait for the Japanese Navy. Did a few pictures of the aircraft. Most of you are familiar with the Mitsubishi Zero. At that point in the war, the Americans didn't have a good answer for the Zero. It was fast. It could climb. It could outclimb anything. It had it was pretty well armed, but it was not well armored. And once the American pilots started figuring out that, in fact, they and again, some of you may know, they captured a Zero up in Alaska that had crashed and was kind of intact, and took it back to San Diego and tore it apart and figured out, what its strengths and weaknesses were, and designed, some of the remakes of some of the Wildcats then were designed to specifically address the Zero. Dauntless dive bomber, and I put this picture in there just because as we get into the battle, the dive bomber was kind of the plane that, it was the plane that did all the damage to the Japanese fleet at Midway. Wasn't the only, certainly the only aircraft there, and I'm not even saying it was the most important aircraft there, but it was the plane that did the damage to the Japanese fleet, and touch on that here again in a minute. This is just a deck load on the Enterprise, taken in the morning of the 4th. So this is the Japanese, when the carriers arrived in the vicinity of Midway, they attacked Midway, and they kind of had a delicate task. They wanted to destroy the infrastructure at Midway, but according to the Japanese side of the battle, they really didn't want to totally destroy the runways, because they wanted to use the runways, or at least have them repairable once they took over the island. So they didn't want to totally destroy the runways, but they wanted to make them unusable enough that the Americans couldn't use them. They were on the first wave that they sent out. They weren't really successful at doing the damage at Midway, either with their dive bombers, with the land bombers, or with the Zeros. And on the way back, the first wave, which was somewhat intact, they did suffer some casualties, from the fighters that were on Midway and some of the anti-aircraft at Midway, but they were mostly intact. And as they were going back to the fleet, they radioed back to Nagumo on his carrier that they felt they needed another attack. That was the first big decision that started things in motion for Midway, starting to go well for the Americans and not go well for the Japanese. There's certainly several more decisions that were made very quickly the morning of June 4th, 1942, that influenced that, but that was the first big one, that Nagumo and on his 4 carriers that were sitting, roughly up in here, was told that he needed to be prepared to find American ships just in case they were nearby and he didn't know it. Well, after he heard he had his about half of his force armed with torpedoes and with armor-penetrating bombs in case some ships did show up, primarily carriers. And when he heard that they needed to make another strike on the Midway, he started to arm those carriers, disarm them with the land bombs and the torpedoes, and start arming them with land bombs to re-attack Midway with the second wave. So, again, with the complexity of the Japanese, it was a very time-consuming procedure to get the torpedoes off, to get land bombs back on. And at about this same time, the Americans had found the Japanese carriers. Yes?
What did we have on Midway? Did we have some squadrons there?
Yeah, we had some B-25s there. There were some land bombers. There were also quite a few old fighter planes. Some old Buffaloes were there on Midway. Overall, about 30-some planes, mostly flown by Marines and not really trained in naval battle, but enough to kind of disturb the Japanese. And actually, the first attack on the carriers here came off of Midway with torpedo bombers. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time here with torpedo bombers. The torpedo bombers of the day, June of 1942, were outdated, for lack of a better word. They were slow, and they needed a lot of protection. They needed wildcat protection. They needed some diversion from dive bombers. They needed to split up the defenses. And I don't have time to go into the specifics of what happened with the torpedo bombers and how this happened, but they ended up going in on a very uncoordinated attack. No fighters, no dive bombers on the scene, and the first wave of torpedo bombers to go after the Japanese carriers here were, for lack of a better word, just kind of sacrificed. There was too much firepower around these carriers, too many Zeros. They had a cap of the combat air patrol above these 4 carriers of some 40 Zeros, and a 12 or 16 torpedo planes just were no match for 40 Zeros. So this kind of evolved into a little bit of a pattern in the morning. This is 8 o'clock, 8 a.m. in the morning, basically. And between 8 o'clock and 9:45, 3 different attacks were made on the Kido-Butai, the 4 carriers here. One from the Enterprise, one from the Hornet. Well, I'll come back to the Hornet, and one from the Yorktown. The Enterprise and the Yorktown torpedo planes got separated for a variety of reasons, mostly clouds, mostly confusion and different radio frequencies that they were on, that they kind of the battle of, or the confusion of the fog of war, I guess is today's word for it. But they ended up arriving upon the Japanese carriers with no fighters and no dive bombers. And that wasn't at all the plan. They'd done a lot of circling and trying to coordinate this as they were leaving Task Force 16 and 17. But all three of those, and I think it was some 40, and I should know this number, and I apologize I don't, but I think it was either high 30s, low 40s, torpedo bombers that made runs at the Japanese fleet. Only 6 of them ever made it back to their ships. The rest were shot down, and only one survivor, which was Ensign Gay, who's wrote a book that has been very popular. But the torpedo runs into the carrier were very, very tragic, I guess is the best way to put it. Very brave men, and as it turns out, probably the reason that the battle turned out the way it did. Probably didn't seem so at the time. And so another kind of strange player, and this is where some of the luck comes in, the USS Nautilus. It was out patrolling the area. It surfaced kind of in the middle of the Kido Butai, in the middle of the Japanese attack fleet amongst the carriers. The captain, Bill Brockman, shot a couple of torpedoes at one of the carriers and one of the one of the cruisers, and just kind of created a nuisance of himself. Here he is amongst 40-some warships in a somewhat aged submarine, circa 1934, I think it was, and he was fearless. And it's a great story with him just on its own that I can't go into, but he was determined that he was going to do his part. Well, he then submerged, came back up, shot a couple more torpedoes, submerged again, and the Japanese had had enough, so they sent a destroyer to go find him. And they continued on toward Midway, and this destroyer and the Nautilus played cat and mouse for over an hour, and Brockman would surface and launch a couple of more torpedoes, and he wasn't hitting anything, but he's creating such a disturbance. And the destroyer eventually never did find him. And how this ties into the Battle of Midway is very important. Piece of this is the American dive bombers from the Enterprise actually were, for lack of a better word, they were lost. And they weren't doing great on fuel. They had left the same time as the torpedo bombers. They took they were vectored a little farther south, so they ended up south of the carriers, and they were looking at open ocean and their fuel gauges, and none of it really looked good. The Japanese fleet had turned a little bit differently than they thought that it would have, and they had no targets. And so there's 28 dive bombers and nothing but open ocean. And Wade McCluskey, who was leading these bombers, looked down and he saw the wake of the destroyer running at top speed, and correctly assumed that, what's this single destroyer doing here by itself? It must be going back to the battle fleet. And he followed, his words were, it looked like an arrow. Because as you've seen, wakes as they widen out, he said it looked like an arrow. And he followed this destroyer and took him right to the 4 carriers. Well, at the same time, that he arrived above the carriers after following the wake of the destroyer that had been chasing the Nautilus, the dive bombers from the Yorktown arrived above the Kido Butai, above the 4 carriers, and by, the only word to use is somewhat luck, they arrived at the same time, and simultaneously, no fighter planes, but here's where the torpedo planes now come back in, and this is very important. The torpedo planes from Midway, from Hornet, from Enterprise, from Yorktown, continuously attacked the carriers. No torpedoes hit the carriers, but it kept them, number one, in evasive maneuvers, so they couldn't get their planes rearmed and get them back up on deck. And number two, it brought their Zeros down for where they normally would be laying in wait for the dive bombers, brought them down almost to the deck where the torpedo planes were at 1,500 feet, 1,000 feet, some less than 1,000 feet. So all of the Zeros had been down there picking off the torpedo planes. And when the bombers arrived over the Japanese carriers, there were no Zeros to be found. And they were flummoxed. They wondered, how are we up here by ourselves? So the dive bombers with 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs from the Yorktown and from the Enterprise simultaneously, not even by plan, just by the way it worked out, dove on the 3 of the 4 carriers. The 4th one, which was the Hiryu, was a little bit removed and out of sight, but in an 8-minute period from 10, I believe it was like 10:20 a.m. to 10:28 a.m., they left 3 of the carriers looking like this. And the Japanese, who thought they were impenetrable, this is the Kaga. This is where Nagumo was. He got caught at the worst possible time. He got caught with planes full of fuel on the hangar deck, torpedoes not even put back in their right place, just pushed to the side as they tried to rearm, then started doing evasive maneuvers because of the torpedo planes coming in. So he got caught with all sorts of explosives on the hangar deck, fully fueled planes, and bombs. The dive bombers with the 500,000-pound bombs went through the decks of the carriers and left the Kaga and the Kagi and the Soryu pretty much in flames in an 8-minute period. So so much turned in that 8-minute period, and so it's as the bombers arrived together, unmolested, it was kind of easy. This is the Akagi under attack, B-17 attack prior to the dive bombers. A couple of these are original pictures, so they're a little bit grainy. So 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers are now aflame. Certainly can't use their flight decks. They're exploding. The torpedoes are now going off on the hangar deck, and 3 of their 4 main attack carriers are out of commission. 2 of them sunk within the hour, and the 3rd one was unsalvageable, leaving 1 carrier, which is the Hiryu, again, one of the Pearl Harbor attack carriers. And when the American dive bombers got back to the Yorktown and the Enterprise, they reported that they had sunk 3 of the carriers. There was another carrier there, and to shorten the story, Fletcher and Spruance sent out scout planes and went out to find the 4th carrier, and they found it relatively quickly. In the meantime, the Hiryu, the carrier they were looking for, had launched an attack. It did find the Yorktown and dropped 3 bombs, 3 hits on the Yorktown, which pretty badly crippled the Yorktown. And they contemplated abandoning ship with the Yorktown, but did not do it, and started repairing it. Repaired the flight deck, got the boilers lit again, and were able to get the Yorktown steaming again, doing about 20 knots. So the Hiryu then launched. The Hiryu took in all the planes that were in the air because they were the only flight deck left for the Japanese. It launched a 2nd attack on the Hiryu with only about 14 planes. 2 of those planes that were all had torpedoes got through, put 2 torpedoes into the Yorktown, which kind of left it looking like this. This is the Yorktown after 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes. American carriers built much more sturdily than the Japanese carriers, at the time, but still listing very badly. And so the scout planes that Spruance had sent out did find the Hiryu, the last Japanese carrier of the 4, and they basically sent out the rest of the air arm from the 3 American carriers, and just in a matter of, I don't know that I have a photo of it or not, but once they found it, in a matter of minutes, it was aflame. I think there were 5 or 6 bomb hits on the Hiryu. For those of you that know the name Dusty Kleiss, he had 2 hits that day, as did Dick Best. They each dropped a bomb on the first attack and also had hits on the Hiryu. So now we've got all 4 Japanese carriers either at the bottom of the ocean or aflame. And at this point, the Japanese are so stunned. Yamamoto, who is behind all of this in the Yamada, in the battleship, as the on-scene commander, in a very short period of time decided he just needed to turn this whole thing around and go back to Japan, because he's now lost 4 of his fleet carriers, and he doesn't know how he's going to tell the Emperor that in a span of 10 hours, all 4 of their high-speed attack carriers are at the bottom of the ocean, or almost at the bottom. The Japanese actually had to send a submarine to put a torpedo or a couple torpedoes into the Hiryu to sink it, which is, they didn't want the Americans, they thought the Americans would tow it back to San Diego and make it a trophy ship or whatever. So that was a lot of buildup for an 8-minute battle to sink 3 carriers, and just in a matter of 8 hours, sink their 4th carrier. The Yorktown actually was sunk by a Japanese sub who had amazingly got through the cordon of protective. It was being towed. They were going to try to tow it back to Pearl Harbor, and a Japanese sub got through, I believe, I-588, and put 2 or 3 torpedoes into it, and they finally just totally abandoned ship, and she slipped under the water some 2 hours later. So the Yorktown that is now, if you've ever been down to South Carolina, that's down at Charleston, is the remade Yorktown that was christened about 7 months later. The original Yorktown was lost at Midway, and the Yorktown that's down in Charleston at the museum down there is the namesake of the Midway. So the end result, Americans lost 1 fleet carrier, 1 destroyer, 307 sailors, pilots, and Marines on Midway were killed. The Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, total killed 3,057. And the even more importance to that number is that their first line pilots were on these carriers. These were guys that have trained for years, and so they lost many of their first line pilots. They lost a lot of planes, as you can imagine, because there's no place to land them now, with all 4 flight decks being unusable. Their aircraft mechanics, munitions loaders, right across the board. They had no idea they could lose a carrier, let alone 4 carriers. So they had a lot of eggs in those baskets. And in that one day, the 4th of June, they lost their entire advantage over the American force in the Pacific, not only by the 4 carriers, but by the trained people that they lost. So the battle was officially over June 7th. Most of what I just described was June 4th. And the 5th, they went out and chased a couple of battleships. The Americans did, sunk one of them. On the 6th, they wanted to make sure what else was in the area as they were slowly retreating back away to the northeast of Midway. And at that point, pretty much Nimitz decided that, you know, it had been such a successful 3 days. The battle was officially over June 7th, 1942, ironically, 6 months to the day after Pearl Harbor. And taking you back to Yamamoto's comment that I talked about at the beginning, he said, I can stay with the Americans for 6 months, and after that, all bets are off because they have just too much military might. And 6 months to the day, the Japanese had lost the offensive in the Pacific War and lost the ability to take, now that their naval power was so wound down that they lost the ability to now take many of the islands with their ground forces because they couldn't protect them without the carriers. And the surface ships just couldn't deal with American carriers and American carrier planes when it came to protecting troops. So there were so many different things that, you know, Midway did. It took away the sea power of the Japanese. It also took away the land power because they couldn't protect the troops. If you've read much about Guadalcanal, they had a heck of a time getting supplies in the Guadalcanal because of the carrier planes that the Americans had in the area. And they were having to do the midnight runs with the high-speed runs with the destroyers just to get supplies in. So it just changed the whole outlook of the war. So I guess just what I was just saying, Midway undoubtedly the turning point of the war. They'd never again, the Japanese never again take the initiative driving the Americans out of any islands. Midway set up the U.S. for victories at Guadalcanal, Marianas, Iwo Jima, Solomon Islands, the rest of the Pacific victories on the march to Japan. So it indeed flipped the coin over to the other side. And as can be said of so many of these things, these types of battles, there are too many heroes at Midway, like the rest of the war, to single any out. And I want to close with thanks to those who made the ultimate sacrifice to help win the war and keep us free. I mean, that can be said over and over and over through the years, but Midway was just another example of that. The torpedo pilots who, you know, many people thought, you know, they were wasted. They weren't wasted. They're brave, brave men. And so 75 years later, we can't forget some of the heroics that went on and what contributed to the Battle of Midway. Questions, discussion, the flight to nowhere? Well, Mike picked this up by omission as much as anything else, but I talked about the dive bombers from the Enterprise and from the Yorktown, but I wasn't saying a whole lot about the Hornet, and the Hornet actually landed no damage on the Japanese fleet. It was the newest ship, newly commissioned, newly trained flyers. The Enterprise had kind of a seasoned group from the Coral Sea and a lot of training at Pearl and some of the small island skirmishes. The Yorktown got a lot of the Saratoga and Lexington flyers to staff them, so well seasoned. Yorktown was very new. They had their flight leader, what's called the Sea Hag, his name was Ring, R-I-N-G, and known for the Stanhope Ring was his name, and he's known for the flight to nowhere, and that's kind of a whole book in itself, and there's just so much that goes into this, but basically they took off, and they were the only ones that actually took off and were together. The fighters, the dive bombers, and the torpedo planes, they were in cloudless sky, and they were together, and the commander in charge of the torpedo squadron, and I can't remember his name right now, but I'll have it, John Waldron, felt that they had been vectored the wrong direction, and he was following his commanding officer away from where he thought the Japanese fleet was. He was part Cherokee, and he prided himself in that and said, I know where they are, and they're not this direction. So I'm making this story a little shorter, because I could go on a long time about this. But he then, at risk of certainly court-martial, made about a 25-degree turn to the southwest, and he said, I know where they are, and broke radio silence, told Stanhope Ring, you're going the wrong way, I'm going after the Japanese fleet. And within 20 minutes, he starts seeing smoke on the horizon, and there's the Japanese fleet. He ran his torpedo planes bravely right through the destroyers and the cruisers, right up on the carriers before they got shot down. But again, all of his torpedo planes, including his, were shot down. One survivor, who was Ensign Gay, who wrote a book, afterwards about he got to see the Battle of Midway from the ocean, from a life raft, basically. But my opinion on what happened is that Stanhope Ring was the leader of the flight group from the Hornet, based on, and I don't want this to be cruel because he was a very good Navy man, but based on seniority and on some of the history he had, not on his flying ability. There were a lot of talented flyers that were in that group, and he wasn't one of them. And his men felt that, maybe he wasn't the best navigator around. And there's debate going to this day. There aren't a lot of records. Michener, who was in charge of the Hornet at that time, his battle report kind of excluded a lot of the key data on how they got vectored out almost due west instead of at more like a 235. Instead of a 235 course, and it's called the flight to nowhere because they flew and they flew and they flew and they found nothing. Finally, his fighters started turning around to go back to either Midway or the Hornet. Some went to Midway, some went to the Hornet, and then his own squadron began to turn around. The dive bombers turned around, then his own squadron of fighters started peeling off one by one because they're running out of gas and they think they're following him west into the Pacific. So eventually he got to flying, he was flying by himself. Imagine what that felt like when all of your flyers behind you peel off one by one by one, and there you are flying by yourself. So he eventually turned around. He went back to the Hornet. Most of them went to Midway. He got back to the Hornet first, and was one of the few that went back to the Hornet and jumped out to, a kind of a hero's welcome, because they didn't know what happened, and they thought, wow, where's the rest of the planes? And then as the story began to come out, it was, kind of a sad story that, that Waldron risked thing, to including court-martial. If he'd have sunk 4 Japanese carriers, he still might have been court-martialed because he directly went against his orders. But he was right. And, I don't know if that's the good reason to go against orders, but he was sure that he was going to keep flying until he ditched in the sea if he kept doing what he was doing. So he did what he thought was right for the country and right for his squadron. But it's known as the Flight to Nowhere. There's tons of information on the Flight to Nowhere on websites, still being debated to this day. Yes.
I'm not a great student of the Pacific War, but you say the Midway destroyed the core of the Japanese sea power, if I hear that right, and yet it took 3 more years before that war was over. So was that, how did that happen? Was that because the Japanese had occupied all these small islands and they had to be taken one by one?
That's the big part of it. Secondly, the Battle of Midway took out at least more than half of their air power. So the Japanese now were, and we've seen, history show this. Now we're on the defensive. The Americans pushed them back to here and then pushed them back to here instead of the other way around. So it was a slow push, but the Japanese had no means to push back because their air power. America now had more carriers coming online relatively quickly in 1942, particularly 1943 and 44, that, you know, from being 3 carriers in the Pacific at the Battle of Midway and then quickly to 2, there were still 3 or 4 more Japanese carriers, smaller non-fleet carriers, but then very quickly America got into double digits and just had overwhelming. So it took the Battle of Midway to stop the momentum that the Japanese Navy had and to put them back on their heels and on the defensive. And then it was just a matter of starting the push, you know, north up the Pacific and east or west in the Pacific to just keep the Japanese on the run. And it gave them time, to your point, to dig into all these small islands. You know, read about Iwo Jima and how dug in they were in Okinawa. And, you know, it was hand to hand, you know, ousting the Japanese. It was no longer a sea battle. And the only weapon that the Japanese ended up with in 1944, 1945 was kamikaze. And particularly in early 1945, I mean, that was the sole weapon that was left. And they were building cheap junk planes just so they could load them with fuel and try to sink American ships, because that was the last ditch effort that they had. And at that point, it was unthinkable for the Japanese to surrender. So they just kept on. It was, I mean, the war was, and most of you know probably more about this part than I do, but the war was lost long before the Japanese surrendered. It was just a matter of time and attrition, you know, at that point. Yes?
You've got to give a lot of credit to that captain of that submarine.
Oh.
Right in the middle of all that.
I do. That's why I brought this up. I mean, Bill Brockman was, I mean, he's an American hero. He's an unsung hero. And he kept popping up and shooting torpedoes, and he wasn't letting them go. And he could have just easily just submerged and eased on out of there. And he directed a squadron of dive bombers to the aircraft carrier. So give a lot of credit to him. I don't. He taught for a little while, I believe, at the Naval Academy, and don't know what happened to him, you know, after that. He wasn't a young man. Yes, yeah, he did. And he wasn't a young man at the time, and taught a little bit at the academy, but I don't know ultimately what happened to him. But an unsung hero, really is. As you know, many of these folks were.
Yes. Were his torpedoes as bad as the rest of them?
Yeah, the torpedoes were pretty bad in June of 1942. A lot of duds, a lot of circle backs, a lot of bad things went on with the torpedoes, and the sub-commanders weren't getting listened to as much as they should have in 1942, and they were claiming they're hitting ships, and all they're hearing is clunk. And Washington really didn't believe it until there was so much overwhelming evidence, because the Japanese torpedoes were good. The long lance torpedoes they had, fast, powerful, long range. So the Americans were at a disadvantage early on in the war, and then eventually caught up with torpedoes, caught up and surpassed them. But yeah, they were pretty bad. They were pretty bad. Very frustrating to the submariners, because they maneuver, and then have a dud. Mike?
I have heard from many sources that Midway was sort of the moment at which the world realized that battleships were dead, and the future of projecting power at sea was aircraft, even though obviously a lot more development had to take place. Would you agree with that, or do you think that's misplaced?
I 100% agree, and Nimitz also agreed with that. And as evidence, he sent no battleships to the Battle of Midway. He sent carriers, destroyers, a couple of cruisers, no battleships. And he still had, all the battleships did not get sunk at Pearl Harbor. In fact, I believe all but 3 of them eventually came back and fought, you know, the rest of the war. But the battleships he had at his disposal, he was not a fan of. They weren't fast enough, and they were yesterday's vessel. They were good for some things like, you know, when you get into an island warfare and you need to throw a lot of artillery into an island to kind of soften it up. They were good for that kind of thing. But as far as pure naval warfare, I totally agree with. I always agree with Nimitz because I think he's brilliant. But I totally agree with him on this one, that, you know, the aircraft carriers were the future, and he kind of proved that. He was a submariner, and he was, you know, very, very skilled in the use of submarines and believed in the subs and the aircraft carriers. Yes?
Have you been registered to Nimitz?
I have not, believe it or not, and I know, it's on my bucket list. It really is. Midway, going to Midway's. I've been to Pearl Harbor, but Midway's on my bucket list. So, thank you all very much.
I know how you're going to get by without this.
Oh,
but
nice.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Yeah,
we appreciate
nice.
it. Hope that's a small token of our appreciation.
I needed a pen
Thank you very
earlier.
much.
So,
This is the end of the
yeah.
program. Thank